Well, hopefully I intrigued some of you with the title of the sermon today. During Advent and Christmas, we examined Luke's account of the birth of Jesus. The first Sunday of the new year, we watch as the young parents bring Jesus to the temple. And in the temple, there was an old man whose name was Simeon, and he takes the baby from Mary, and he cradles Jesus in his own arms, and holding the baby, he says, "Lord, now let thy servant depart in peace. Mine eyes have seen thy salvation." Only a few days old, and one has already seen that Jesus was salvation. From the temple, we follow Jesus out to the Jordan River, where John the Baptist baptized him. And he's preaching and baptizing. And Jesus is there to provide the fullness of salvation. Following his baptism, Jesus goes into the wilderness to be alone. And there he faces 3 temptations. And then he emerges from the wilderness victorious. And then he returns to Nazareth, where he's been brought up. And he's almost killed in Nazareth. They're not quite sure what to do with him. They don't understand what he's saying, and they really don't like what he's saying. In his hometown, in his church, Jesus reads the scripture lesson, and when he's through, he folds up the scroll, and he gives it back to the attendant, and then he looks around and says quietly, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." That was all. It was a short sermon. I recently read a book called Holy Sweat by Tim Hansel. And he tells of a guest preacher in a rather large church who began by saying, "There are 3 points to my sermon today." Many people at that point rolled their eyes because they'd heard this many times before. And he says, "My first point is this. At this time, there are approximately 2 billion people starving to death in the world." The reaction of the congregation was about the same. They've heard statistics like this before. They've heard things like this before. A few rolled their eyes. And then he said, "My second point." Now people were starting to perk up. We're only 10 or 15 seconds into this sermon, and he's already on his second point. This could be good news today. He pauses, and he says, "My second point is that most of you probably don't give a damn." He pauses as the gasps and rumblings go through the congregation. And then he says, "And my third point is that the real tragedy among Christians today is that many of you are more concerned that I said damn in church than you are that I said 2 billion people in this world are starving to death." And then he sat down. The whole sermon took less than a minute. But in many ways, it was one of the most powerful sermons he'd ever preached in his life. He was reminding them that we are called not just to piety, but to genuine morality. We are called not just to read the Bible, but to do. We are called not just to be Christians, but to act as Christians. And that is what Jesus was telling his hometown. He clearly denotes the kind of ministry he came to pursue. He came to have a ministry to the poor, to the outcast, to the blind, to the unaffirmed. And Jesus made a bold claim that day: "I am the Christ." Salvation has become real, visible today. And that's not what they expected to hear. And the scripture goes on and says, when they all heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with wrath, and they rose up and they put him out of the city. The good news was bad news. Well, I just spent 3 days in Atlanta, Georgia, at the SEDEPCA board meeting. And I was with about 20 people from all over the United States, all who have a passion and a heart for changing lives, for changing the world one person at a time. You know, there isn't one person in this room that can change the world totally. But every single person in this room can change the world, one person at a time. And I think we get so overwhelmed when we listen to TV and we hear the problems that we think there's nothing we can do. We just hear the TV and then we turn it off and we shake our heads and say, oh, I don't think I want to listen to the news anymore. And yet, if we do that, we're not following what Christ is calling us to do. We're not being disciples, because Christ is saying you have to do something about it. Even if it's only one little thing, even if it's only just something that you think couldn't possibly make a difference. Emerson, who all of you met in November last year at our church, at the board meeting, talked about Guatemala in context now. And he had some very upsetting statistics to share. And what he shared was that the poverty rate in Guatemala has actually significantly risen since the year 2000. And the extreme poverty rate has risen even more. So to live in poverty, one in Guatemala must make $1,300 a year. That is considered poverty in Guatemala. All right, I want you all to just think about that for a minute. $1,300 a year. To live in extreme poverty in Guatemala means that you make $700 a year. Now, I've converted those quetzales to US dollars, but that gives you some idea of what these people are living on per year. And the sad statistic is that the poverty rate has increased dramatically. It's up over 53% now. It's a country that's really hurting. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And so this organization, this one little organization, works there to try to make a difference, one life at a time. And it's amazing the work they do. This year is their 30th anniversary, and one of the things that we talked about as a board is, how do we acknowledge that? What can we do? And so one of the things that we're going to be doing when we go down on our trip, Greg is going to bring his camera, and we're going to ask every one of our folks who's been on a trip before to, in 30 seconds or less, tell how their lives have been changed by visiting Guatemala. 30-second soundbite. So those of you who are sitting here, prepare, because you've got 30 seconds to say how your life has changed since you went to Guatemala. And we're gonna do that all year with all the groups that come, and then we're gonna try to put together a video to show the difference. I'm gonna share a couple of examples. One of the gentlemen on our board is a physician from Galveston, Texas. And his first trip to Guatemala was last year. He goes to a Presbyterian church in Galveston, and he was involved with folks that were going on mission trips, but he'd never gone before. And so he went, and he took his extremely painfully shy son with him, who was an engineering student. He was getting his master's in engineering. He went to Guatemala, he and his son. His son came home, and his life was so impacted that he changed his major, and he is now in Austin Seminary becoming a minister from one trip. Now that sounds extreme, but we have had youth in our own church whose lives have changed, who had different career paths in mind, and then changed what they wanted to do based on the time they spent there, based on meeting people and seeing how other people live, and seeing just, I can't describe to you enough what these folks are like there. The absolute joy they have every morning getting up with nothing. Joy that God woke them up this morning. Joy that they might not have enough food for the whole day to eat. They might not have enough food for their families, but God woke them up this morning. And it's another brand new day. And that's reason enough to celebrate and to share what they have with someone else. That's an example of what we see there. And so to get 20 people in a room who all have a passion like that, it's exciting. It fuels you. It gets you. It just encourages you to not give up, to want to keep doing the work, to find other ways to help each other. That's what Jesus is saying. The good news is that I come with a different kind of ministry. I don't come like you're expecting. I don't come saying, take your best lamb and make a burnt offering to the Lord. I'm saying, take your best lamb and go out and feed folks in your village that can't get lamb. I'm saying, reach out to the blind. The blind and the women, the widows were like beggars. And Jesus is saying, no, reach out to them. That's who you should be ministering to. And the people weren't prepared to hear that. Because they're much more happy to sit in their seats in the synagogue and offer their burnt offerings and feel that they're doing their part to be good religious folks. And Jesus is saying, no. You can't just sit there in that pew. It doesn't work that way, you see. Because when you get up, the mission field is outside that door. The minute you walk outside that door today, that's where mission is. That's where your job as a disciple of Christ starts. That's what Jesus is saying. So I have to say to you, are you courageous enough to get up out of this pew at the end of this service and walk out there into a world that's hard, that slaps us in the face, that has all sorts of problems? I sat on the plane last night with a woman from Baltimore, an African-American woman who has lived through all of the troubles that Baltimore had, and we talked all the way home about what that was like for her community and for her church and what they were doing to try to help. And her pastor, she's a pastor, her husband's a pastor, and her father is a pastor, and they all went out and they stood with the police in the lines to try to keep peace in Baltimore. And she was afraid. But she didn't sit in her pew. She knew she couldn't change Baltimore by herself, but she could stand in that line. That's what the women in Guatemala are doing when they go and they protest the miners coming in to take over their land and to take over their properties. And they lay in the middle of the road so that the trucks can't roll through. They're getting out of their pews and they're doing something. Bob Pierce, the founder of World Vision, who is the organization through which we do Crop Walk, lived by this motto: may my heart break with the things that break the heart of God. That is the gospel that Jesus was telling his hometown that day. That is the gospel of salvation. That's the real news of salvation. To release the captives, to recover the sight of the blind, to help the poor and the oppressed. And so today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. Today, not tomorrow, not next year, because you have to get up out of this pew in a few minutes, and you have to go out into the mission field. What will you do? Amen.